Out of Edinburgh, just welcome all of you most warmly here this evening. I have sort of 2.5 responsibilities. Responsibility one is, say, if you haven't read that, it's going to be too late. If there's a fire, go to the George Hotel, and then come back when the fire's over. Second responsibility, far more relevant to the evening, is if you've got a mobile phone, please turn it off. Third responsibility, I will hand over in a moment, but is to welcome all of those people who are taking part. It's quite unusual for us in the Royal Society of Edinburgh to have these so-called mock trials. I've only attended one myself before in my time as president, but it was a very, very successful way of airing a significant issue and getting different viewpoints on it, and then seeing what the reaction is before and after of those who have listened to and paid attention to the arguments. It requires a judicial presence to do all this with skill, and luckily we have Lord Cullen of Whitekirk, Douglas Cullen, who is a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, who has had an extremely distinguished legal career, who is a life peer, and who is a Knight of the Thistle. So we are extremely lucky to have Douglas Cullen with us this evening, and I'm very happy to hand over to him and allow him to conduct the evening's proceedings. Douglas.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I, for my part, welcome you to this mock trial. And the question, in case you've forgotten it, is Trident, should we keep it? Now, first of all, some explanation as to the procedure. We have two teams taking part. Team A, who will maintain the question should be answered yes, will begin. Their leader is the Right Honourable George Robertson of Port Ellen, the former Defence Secretary and Secretary-General of NATO. Then Team B, who say no, will reply, and their leader is Professor Michael Clark, Director of United Services Institute. The leader of each team will make opening and closing statements and introduce and call their witnesses. There will be 2 witnesses for each team, and they will be subject to cross-examination by the opposing team. There are pre-arranged times for each of these stages, but I shall try to keep that matter under control. I act as the judge in this mock trial. My role is neutral. I will not ask questions, save perhaps for the purpose of clarification. And after the closing statement for Team B, I will give you a short summing up of what we've heard today. Now, before the opening statement for Team A, you'll have the opportunity to cast a vote on the question before us. That will be vote number 1. And after my summing up, you'll have an opportunity to vote again. That's vote number 2. So we can see perhaps what difference the arguments and the evidence have made to your thoughts on this question. Now, to the voting system. You should have a keypad in front of you. You should each have one. Would you please turn on your voting pad now by pressing the power button which is near the bottom of the front of the keypad. You should see a green LED, and it should be flashing quickly. You need to join the class, as it were, to enable you to vote. So to do so, you should enter 2 digits. They are 3131. So please enter that now. If you've been successful in getting connection, the LED flash will flash slowly. But if you're not connected, you'll see red. So if you see red, try again, enter 21 again, and do so as quickly as possible. 31, sorry, 31. Beg your pardon. 31. Now, I hope all of you have got that cope with without difficulty. So I hope you're all now connected. Now, when it comes to the vote, you'll be able to vote by pressing the appropriate number on the keypad. And there'll be a countdown clock shown on the screen here, which shows you how much time you've got in which to make your vote. And during that time, you can change your answer, the vote, up to 3 times, if you're indecisive. But the computer will take only your last answer, whatever it is. And the results will appear eventually on the screen as a bar chart when the timer stops. Now we're going to have a practice question, and as you can see, that's the question on the screen. There are 5 possible answers, almost regardless of whether they are credible or not. But please, would you try to vote for one of the 5 options, and we can see what happens. As you can see, you've got a countdown, 56 seconds and so on, down to, and once it's nil, we can get a result. And there we are. Apparently it's sunny. Well, that's the system that we're operating this evening, and in due course you will get the appropriate question for the subject of the debate. Now, as I turn to that question, perhaps I could mention a few facts which I think are uncontroversial. Trident is a ballistic missile system based on 4 Vanguard-class submarines. Trident entered service for the Royal Navy in 1994 as the replacement for Polaris. Each submarine carries 16 Trident missiles, which have a range of 7,500 miles. In recent years, as I understand it, there has been a reduction in the number of nuclear warheads per submarine. Trident has a 30-year lifespan, which is due to end in the year 2024. You may have read recently, in the press perhaps, that a final decision on replacing that system is not now due until 2016. Now we turn to your opportunity to cast your vote in what I call Vote 1. So in regard to the question, Trident should we keep it? You see, perhaps on the screen we can have 3 questions. Yes is number 1, 2 is not sure or abstain, and 3 is no. So would you now cast your votes at this point in regard to the question and these possible answers? 14, 6, and 31. Thank you very much. Now, I'll now call on Lord Robertson to make his opening statement.
Thank you, Lord Cullen. I started a lifetime in politics at Abnadam Pier at the Holy Loch beside Dunoon, protesting at the arrival of American Polaris submarines in that quiet Argyll sea loch. I proudly carried a poster which said "Ban the bomb," and was a profound but defiant embarrassment to my father, who had the same name and who was the head of the local police CID. My admission of this bit of my personal history to President George W. Bush came as a bit of a shock to him when I led NATO at the time, but until he realised that we were the same age, and that when I was marching with enthusiasm, he was drinking with exactly the same spirit. I was then to go on in my political life to be the guardian of Britain's independent deterrent submarines, and then to become Secretary-General of the NATO alliance, which relies in the final analysis on nuclear security. Some would say that that was quite some rite of passage. But worldly experience was to undermine my faith in that bold slogan that I carried past Lazaretto Point in 1961. Whereas in these youthful days I had the thought that by giving up Britain's deterrent, we would start a benign chain reaction of disarmament. The hard reality was that there were massive reductions in nuclear arsenals, especially after the end of the Cold War, by the US, Russia, Britain and France, with all the de-targeting, de-alerting and confidence-building measures that took place between the permanent 5 members of the Security Council of the United Nations. However, all of that did nothing, absolutely nothing, to stop countries like India and Pakistan, North Korea and Israel from acquiring nuclear weapons, for Iran and Iraq to want them, and with only the threat of an Iraq-style invasion forcing Colonel Gaddafi to disclose and then destroy his planned acquisitions. And when, as this country's Defence Secretary, in the 1998 Strategic Defence Review, I made the biggest ever unilateral reductions in our deterrent strength, so that our country now has the smallest stockpile of nuclear warheads and is the only nuclear weapon state with a single system, there was absolutely no reciprocation. And today the Chinese are substantially increasing its nuclear forces, and Russia is upgrading its strategic nuclear capability. There was no benign chain reaction, no reversal of proliferation. And that wasn't because the nuclear states had dragged their heels on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty obligations. No, it wasn't because of that at all. It was because these new states had their own and usually local reasons for acquiring nuclear weapons. North Korea in relation to China and the United States, India in relation to Pakistan and vice versa, Iraq under Saddam and Iran in relation to each other, and Israel in relation to both. So whatever we on these islands do, and even what the Americans and the Russians do, these particular rationalizations and deep-seated drivers are going to remain. And to believe otherwise is to make a serious and perhaps an irresponsible miscalculation. Now, proliferation is indeed dangerous. It's risky, it's expensive, and it's worrying, but it is a completely different issue. Ballistic missile technology is spreading, and so is chemical and biological weapons knowledge, but it is unrelated to nuclear deterrence by the major powers in the world. So here is the rub. Do we give up, without conditions or reciprocation, Britain's nuclear deterrent? That's what this debate about Trident is all about. There is no cheap, safe, effective alternative way for Britain to stay with deterrence, as my two witnesses will be spelling out to you later on. Only Trident, with one of its 4 submarines on continuous patrol, unseen, undetectable, and invulnerable, can guarantee that no enemy of ours will miscalculate and believe that it can win a conventional war. If we end the Trident missile system, or effectively end it by choosing not to continue by building new submarines, then we'll be out of the business effectively forever. To try and recreate it in the face of any emerging new threat that might come in the future would take us at least 20 years to do and cost a fabulous amount of money. So we're in deterrence with Trident, or we irrevocably give up for good our independent deterrent. Now, in a volatile, fractious, and highly unpredictable world, to take such a momentous decision on behalf of future generations would be, and I put it to you with great seriousness, a profoundly irresponsible step to take. Nuclear deterrence is stable, understandable, and successful. For 65 years, it has prevented the kind of great power wars which disfigured the 20th century and indeed many centuries before that. And who among us will dare to predict the nature of the world and its risks and its threats for the next 30 to 40 years when the renewed Trident will be in service? After all, how many people actually predicted the Arab uprising that took place this year? And of the few who actually did think it might happen, how many of them predicted that it would be Tunisia and Egypt that would be the first countries to go? How many people predicted the suddenness of the Berlin Wall coming down? or the Soviet Union disintegrating just 30 months after it was driven from Afghanistan. There were precious few, even among the pundits and experts, who would have dared to prophesy that by the second year of this new millennium, all but one members of the Warsaw Pact and 3 former communist states, Soviet states, would be full members of the European Union and NATO. Think back yourselves to that. And did we really have the imagination to think that foreign terrorists would drive 2 civil airliners into New York's Twin Towers? Or that Saddam would invade Kuwait in 1990? Or that tiny, starving North Korea would launch a ballistic missile over Japan's airspace? So who among us will say hand on heart that they know that there will be no enemy, no threat to us or to our allies emerging or maturing over the next 40 years? In a world of constant surprises, is this really the right time to make a once-in-a-lifetime choice to abandon our deterrent and leave nuclear deterrence to the Americans and to the French? That's the real issue, ladies and gentlemen, before us tonight, and the issue that will be before the Parliament of this country, who will eventually have to decide. So I want to ask you to think about the following questions. Let us just say that this country was to give up its nuclear deterrent. And if the other major nuclear powers, the nuclear weapon states, were to do likewise, and just suppose as well that we managed also to persuade India and Pakistan and North Korea and Israel to do so as well, and we got Iran to end its nuclear ambitions. And what if, again, there was actually to be a genuinely thorough intrusive inspection regime for this new situation, and some form, and this stretches my imagination a little bit too far, a system of enforcing the global zero to prevent cheating on the system? What then? What then? We can't disinvent nuclear weapons technology. That's not possible. And was the world that existed before nuclear weapons were invented so wonderful and so peaceful that it's actually worth returning to? I think the word hardly describes that situation. And would not some countries, especially those with suspected and hostile neighbours, want to be ready, perhaps in private, to recreate nuclear weapons just in case an aggressor cheated on the new non-nuclear regime? How stable would that supposedly nuclear-free world actually be? I'll leave you to ponder the answers to these important questions, but I want to make 2 final points to help you with your decision tonight. If Britain were to act alone by ending Trident now and to opt out of national deterrence, but of course leaving the American nuclear umbrella in place and leaving France as the only European nuclear power, would we actually be believed? Would it really be seen as a selfless act of supreme leadership in the field of non-proliferation? Or would other people smell a rat? The suspicion in a very cynical and very suspicious world would not be to give us the benefit of the doubt, but would be to suspect that such an act of national self-relegation must be a cover for us having found a new secret and more effective way of protecting ourselves against aggression. From my own personal and extensive experience at the top of world politics, I can tell you that it would not act as a generator of trust and of copycat moves, but rather it would lead to more tension, more suspicion, and frankly a bigger arms race. Trident is not a war-fighting weapon. Actually, it's the very opposite. It's a political statement. It's designed to stop an aggressor even thinking that he can win a conventional war. If it was to be used, then deterrence would have failed. But with these silent submarines out there under the oceans of the world is a safer place because the usual risk-taking and national gambling, which was the characteristic of our continent and our world before the Second World War, would today, because that cannot happen, because the aggressor knows that he would inflict immeasurable damage on himself. It would not be worth taking the risk, and nobody has done it in the last 65 remarkable years. So I conclude, we live in an unpredictable and complex world today. Power, political and economic power, is shifting from the west to the east and to the south, from the developed countries to the emerging economies with their new clout and their new ambitions, from stable nation states slotted into ideological groupings to an increasing number of very fragile and indeed some cases failed states who spread instability and terror, migration and violence, piracy and organised crime into new unstable neighbourhoods. So is this the time of all times to step into the unknown by giving up the deterrent which since the end of the Second World War has ended major power interstate warfare for our lucky generation? Well, that young political enthusiast who was me, who carried that ban the bomb banner all these years ago, still believes with a passion in building a world of trust and stability and prosperity based on openness and common values, so that nuclear weapons would be neither wanted nor necessary. And I have spent a lot of time in my life working to do precisely that. But I believe that you need to have that kind of world before you take the gamble of doing away with nuclear deterrence. And that's why I'm asking you to vote yes to keep Trident tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Robertson. Can we have your first witness, please?
Lewis. Oddly enough, the three of us on this side of the argument all went to St Andrews University. I hope that doesn't condemn us. And should it do so,
I was there too.
I took a Dundee degree at the end of my time there as well. But I do have an honorary doctorate from St Andrews, so we're all St Andrews graduates in one form or another. Lewis Mooney was a student of medicine at Dundee when I was there. He qualified as a doctor, first and practiced in psychiatry, and which was suitable for the future life as a politician. And in public health, he became the Member of Parliament for Kirkcaldy and stood down to allow another obscure person to take that seat. And he's now a member of the House of Lords, but was a junior defence minister in the first Blair government. Lewis, can I ask you some questions about the possible alternatives to Trident? There are people who say that we can have a cheap and cheerful option, that we don't have to go down the road of having 4 nuclear submarines with thermonuclear ballistic missiles. What do you think these alternatives are, and what are the major criticisms that would rule them out?
Right. Well, basically you have 6 choices if you're going to have a system. You have air, either conventional or cruise-based; land, either static or mobile missiles; or sea, using standard ICBMs, or a cruise-based system. And it's the latter 2 that most focus obviously has been on. Air clearly is highly vulnerable, both as far as bases are concerned and also in the process of attack. And therefore are not, by definition, truly strategic deterrent weapons. Cruise missiles can be launched from the air, but as I'll say later on, they have the same disadvantages as those launched from beneath the sea. As far as land is concerned, in a country the size of ours, sites would probably of necessity be static, and therefore again vulnerable to preemption by a first strike. Not only that, of course, but on the possession of a weapon system based on that also leads to the possibility that you yourselves might feel obliged to initiate a first strike in order to use your weapon before thinking that there was a threat directly applied to it. Mobile systems tend to be tactical, the smaller missiles, and frankly in a country the size of ours, not really an option. I suppose we could run them up and down Macrahanish airstrip, which is long enough, but scarcely relevant. So we're basically looking at sea-based systems, the present system and the alternative. The present system provides a constant threat. It is at present invulnerable. It will, if used, inflict unacceptable damage on an opponent without question, and therefore it will detain aggression. Cruise missiles. Now I must have to confess that for a short while I was quite attracted to this option because I saw it as the answer to all our prayers, using an existing submarine, using a lighter, smaller missile, lessening costs, and costs are of course a significant matter, as I'm sure we'll be turning to. With cruise you have problems. You have a problem of range, you have a problem of payload, the speed and the cost. First of all, it requires a complete redesign of the present cruise missiles. There's no present cruise missile that could carry a conceivable nuclear warhead, which are very much larger than the high explosive packages which are carried just now. Second, range. The range of a cruise missile at present is round about maximum about 1,000 miles, maybe a little more. Can be tweaked and stretched. But remember, to have an effective deterrent, you must be able to cover the land that you suspect the threat might come from. And therefore, you're looking at least doubling the range of the missile. As far as speed goes, it's a subsonic missile. It operates by dodging. Up until now, it's been used against countries which don't have any technology which could protect against that type of technology. And therefore it is a relatively invulnerable weapon. That would not be the case if you were using it in a strategic sense against a potential strategic aggressor. The warhead would require a complete redesign. It would require a new warhead. I was actually, one of my responsibilities in the MOD for 4 years was actually the maintenance of the deterrent in purely technical terms. So I had quite a considerable oversight of what went on with it. And I can assure you, redesigning a thermonuclear warhead is not easy. Moreover, the chances are it would be smaller, both in, obviously it have to be smaller in size, but it also be smaller in payload. And therefore, to certain people, might become an attractive weapon of tactical use as opposed to strategic use. Now, we gave up our tactical nuclear weapons many years ago, because we saw that as a suitable step towards reducing tension. To reintroduce a missile now, which is capable of being used in a tactical sense, would, to my mind, be very irresponsible. But for all these reasons, the costs involved in switching to a cruise-based system are enormous. Because not only do you have to redesign the missile and the payload, you also have to redesign the submarines, because they're not going to be able to launch something the size that's going to have the range and the payload capacity that you're looking for. It'll be more expensive. Even if feasible, even if all problems have solved, it is still not a fully deterrent weapon, and therefore, to my mind, it is not really an alternative. So, continuous at-sea deterrent. The last question really is whether we can get by with 3 submarines, the suitable hair shirt economy option, if you like. You know, it's just a funny phrase to use when you're talking about the sort of sums that we're talking about. The 3 subsystem at present is not guaranteed to be continuous, and the whole point of a deterrent system is that it must be continuous. This argument was heard before. In the 1960s, the Labour Party was deciding whether to have 3 or 4 Polaris submarines. And the argument is, those of you, I apologise if you've heard this before, but the argument was summed up by Michael Stewart, who was not known for the depth of his contributions to the defence debate. He said, I was a member of the board of the Co-op in Fulham in the 1930s, and we had to decide, all good Methodists, whether or not to introduce alcohol. And as good Methodists, we decided to introduce alcohol, but only very poor quality. And I suggest to you that if we go for a 3-sub option, just as was the case in the 1960s, we would be ending up with an inferior option to the one that we have.
Thanks to you. The argument is often made that we can't afford Trident. It's too expensive. It's a big burden. It squeezes our conventional forces, and therefore, purely on the grounds of economy, we should give it up. What do you think about that argument?
All public spending is a matter of making choices for how you raise the money and what you spend it on. I believe that the package, since it's spent over a period of years, is affordable. The government threw a rather nasty surprise last year when they said the defence budget, as it's constituted at present, would have to bear the cost. I suspect they may find out that that is unrealistic, because that's never been the case before. But again, you have to look at the platform, the weapon, the missile, and the infrastructure to look after it. And of these, the only one that provides a significant cost in the first instance is the platform, the submarine. Because the submarines have a finite life, and there's no doubt that while we can stretch and tweak them a wee bit, they will not last for longer than about another 15 years, absolute maximum, if we were able to do it, and probably not as long as that. The estimates in the recent Initial Gate parliamentary report by Liam Fox suggested that the cost of overall of the system, of the subs that is, would be between 11 and 14 billion pounds, spread over a number of years, because of course the subs are built in sequence. And to my mind, that is an affordable option.
How much does it represent of the total defence budget of the country over the 40 years?
Over the 40 years, I think it represents up to about 5%, give or take a percentage. I mean, I don't want to try and sound too precise and scientific on this. Forecasting costs in advance, as anybody who's dealt with governments, is very much an uncertain science. But the ballpark figure would be a maximum of that.
You had a big responsibility in the Ministry of Defence as a Minister for the people policy, and clearly the reliability of the deterrent depends very much on the training and the trained crews who operate it. Under an alternative system, do you think that there is any likelihood of achieving the same level of skilled training into which you would put responsibility for something like nuclear weapons?
I would have very grave doubts about doing that. We have built up an expertise in the use of submarines and the technology that goes built around the missiles over a period of 40 years. To switch, I mean, and in the same way that the suggestion that we could possibly use Astute or a modification of it would add, to my mind, an unacceptable burden on the crews of that submarine. The great thing about the Vanguard system is that it's a single-use weapon, and therefore a single-use platform, and therefore all the training is concentrated upon it. But there's also the matter of training of staff to verify that your weapons are actually still in working order. We can't, of course, let them off conveniently underground like we used to. We've forsworn that. There's a great deal of effort's gone into that, in building up that expertise, and that would continue into the future.
If you were asked to put a sum of money in a gamble as to whether or not a threat to this country could emerge over the next 40 years, how much money would you put on the table?
None. Well, so that's not quite true. If I was betting the farm, it would be fine as long as it was somebody else's farm. But I certainly wouldn't bet my own. I honestly don't think we can predict into the future. The world is a dangerous and uncertain place, and all the chances are it will remain so or become even more dangerous and more uncertain. And I'm speaking as an expert in gambling. I'm a senior director of the largest offshore gambling company in the world.
That's one of the reasons I asked you the question.
I wasn't sure if you knew that or not, John.
Actually,
apologies.
The bookies usually get the results of elections long before the politicians do. Right, I think that concludes your evidence, Lewis. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
And your second witness, please.
My next witness is Professor Paul Cornish, another graduate of St Andrews University, who served in the British Army in the Royal Tank Corps, served in the Foreign Commonwealth Office as an analyst on arms control, was a lecturer at Cambridge University, and now holds the Carrington Chair of International Security Studies at the Royal Institute of International Affairs at Chatham House. Paul, can I ask you about the way in which nuclear arsenals have gone in the world? There's a perception that there are huge numbers of nuclear weapons, and that they remain a threat simply by their numerical strength. How has that changed over the years since nuclear weapons were invented?
George, thank you, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I might perhaps begin, if I could, just by saying this, that I think we're discussing this evening one of the most difficult problems in contemporary security policy, politically, strategically, economically and morally. Now, I'm here as part of the defence, if you like, this evening, and I have to say at the outset that I believe that the only rational choice to make in this very uncertain and fast-changing world, as we've all been saying, is to maintain the continuous at-sea deterrent, submarine-based, for the foreseeable future. In other words, just to be absolutely clear, my view is that we should keep Trident, and indeed we must. Let me give you some numbers. At the height of the Cold War in the mid-1980s, global nuclear warhead holdings were as follows. The US had roughly 23,000, the Soviet Union about 41,000, the UK 300, France 355, China 425. So that's roughly 65,000 warheads in the world. Some people assess that they were actually closer to 71 or 72,000. But let's just stick with 65,000 for the moment and skip on 25 years to this year. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, as of January 2011, there are well over 20,000 nuclear warheads around the world, whether they're deployed in reserve or awaiting dismantlement. And they break down as follows. About 8,500 American, over 11,000 Russian, fewer than 225 UK, although that ceiling is now dropping as a result of the Defence Review last year to a ceiling of 180, 300 French, 240 Chinese, between 80 and 100 Indian, between 90 and 110 Pakistani, and about 80 Israeli. So roughly between 20 and 21,000 nuclear warheads. What should we infer from this barrage of numbers? Well, I think there are two observations to be made, and the first is that the United States, the UK and others have reduced their warhead stockpiles dramatically since the end of the Cold War. And the second, I think, is that over 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, there are still, as I've said, tens of thousands of these weapons in the world. And what I haven't discussed, of course, are those opaque nuclear proliferators who are widely believed to be on the threshold of nuclear weapons status. And, of course, there are extremist groups who have expressed, I'm not making this up, who have expressed an interest in acquiring a weapon. So I draw 2 conclusions from those observations. The first is that there cannot be said to be a causal connection between, on the one hand, the programs of nuclear weapon reduction undertaken by Cold War nuclear weapon states, and on the other hand, the prevention or discouragement of nuclear weapon proliferation. Or if there is such evidence for such a causal connection, I can't see it, I'm not aware of it. Nuclear weapon reduction has been taking place, but so has nuclear weapon proliferation. My second conclusion, conversely, is that there seems also to be no necessary positive correlation between, on the one hand, the retention of a reduced nuclear arsenal by the UK and other states, and on the other hand, the decision by some states to proliferate and acquire nuclear weapons. If there were such a correlation, then why is it that so few states have become proliferators? So when George Shultz, William Perry, Henry Kissinger and Sam Nunn argued, as they did in the Wall Street Journal in March of this year, that continued reliance on nuclear weapons as the principal element for deterrence is encouraging, or at least excusing, the spread of these weapons and will inevitably erode the essential cooperation necessary to avoid proliferation, protect nuclear materials and deal effectively with new threats, end quote, then I have to ask, where is the evidence for that very strong assertion? There is just as much evidence for me to make the assertion that it's been the retention of reduced nuclear stockpiles by established nuclear weapon states that has in fact reduced or controlled proliferation. But my main point, George, is that I think we suffer from an overwhelming strategic conceit if we assume that nuclear weapons proliferation is like a tap which we can turn on and off as we wish, as if it's our ideas, our declarations and our actions that determine the proliferation or non-proliferation decisions of others. I'm afraid the evidence suggests that other governments around the world are able to make up their own minds on this matter for their own reasons, and I believe that we should do the same.
Thank you. The campaign for Global Zero foresees, I think actually in the next 20 years, all of the nuclear weapon states giving up their weapons, an intrusive regime being created, although I must say I don't know how that's going to be done. What is your view about steps towards that position?
Thank you. I have some remarks on this. The Global Zero movement was initiated by a series of articles in 2007-2008, written by Shultz, Perry, Kissinger and Nunn again. And it's a movement that very rapidly acquired an impressive global following. The initiators, Shultz and so on, are all people of vast experience and very great intellect. And I don't in any sense question their motives or their sincerity, nor that of the other advocates of Global Zero. I simply do not accept that this idea is either feasible or safe. I can, of course, accept it as an ideal and a very fine one, but that is as far as it should go. To answer your question directly, George, the Global Zero movement argues for, quote, the phased, verified elimination of all nuclear weapons worldwide because their members, end of quote, because their members, quote, believe that the only way to eliminate the nuclear threat, including proliferation and nuclear terrorism, is to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, secure all nuclear materials, and eliminate all nuclear weapons, colon, Global Zero. I don't intend to take on the argument in detail here. In any case, I can do no better than the very comprehensive demolition that was performed by Joseph Joffe and James Davis in their Foreign Affairs article earlier this year. I commend it to you. Towards the end of their article, they described Global Zero as, quote, not merely irrelevant, but possibly tragic, obstructing the sensible policies required to maintain a credible modern deterrent. And they conclude their article as follows, if I may. So the goal should be, they say, to craft a different Global Zero, a regime that would allow zero fissionable material and weapons technology to pass into the wrong hands, especially into those of Terror International. This is the most pressing threat in a world where the risk of great power violence has faded. It also comes with the promise of real achievement, as Global Zero does not. Just to conclude on this point, as a description of a world in which we would all prefer to live, I think it is impossible to find fault with the idea. But it's a different matter to ask whether such a world is one we're ever likely to see, and whether, in seeking it, we might place ourselves in more danger and instability rather than less. I do feel that the Global Zero idea is rather like the Holy Grail. All have heard of it, most are attracted to it, but none of us are ever likely to see it. Shultz, Perry and Kissinger and Nunn have also recognized this logic themselves. From the March 2011 Wall Street Journal article, which I referred to earlier, they say this: as long as nuclear weapons exist, America must retain a safe, secure and reliable nuclear stockpile, primarily to deter a nuclear attack and to reassure our allies through extended deterrence. So the initiators of the Global Zero argument have effectively pulled the rug from under the movement.
Thank you. Well, of course, I signed another article, as I'm sure one of the witnesses on the other side will say, in support of some of the aspects of that, because we all seek the same ideal, as I said in my opening speech. But a lot of sentiment about Trident and nuclear weapons in general has a moral basis, with people believing that nuclear weapons are inappropriate and disproportionate, and that therefore on moral grounds alone weapons of mass destruction like the Trident missile system are unacceptable in the world today. What do you say to that sentiment that's around, and I'm sure which has driven some people to have voted the way they did tonight?
I think something along those lines was said by Cathy Jameson, MP for Kilmarnock and Loudon, in the nuclear deterrent debate.
Loudon,
Sorry?
Just to correct my witness, it's Kilmarnock and Loudon.
Loudon, I beg her pardon, and yours.
Emphasis on loud.
Loudon. She asked whether the Secretary of State for Defence, Dr. Liam Fox, whether he understood, quote, that many people will find it shocking that we are talking about value for money in the context of weapons of mass destruction for which no moral case can be made. Now, I couldn't disagree more strongly with that. I believe there is a very clear and very imperative ethical case for the retention of an independent nuclear deterrent, and I'm going to offer three, if I may, brief arguments. The first is that if we define deterrence very broadly, and if it's the prevention of an unacceptable action by the threat of punishment or by the denial of the chance of success, then I think we've always been very suspicious of it on ethical grounds, simply because the act which would justify the response which we threaten, or the denial measure which we'll take, has by definition not yet happened. We're therefore in the realms of prevention and anticipation, and we're rightly suspicious of self-serving arguments which can't, and we're told need not, be substantiated empirically. So what we've settled on, as a rule of thumb, is proportionality. What we threaten to do, or what we decide to deny, must be proportionate to the threat that we face. But then we come to nuclear deterrence. The proportionality argument appears to collapse. How can the annihilation of perhaps tens of thousands of people, the destruction of vast areas and the long-term pollution of the earth by radioactive fallout, how can all that be considered proportionate to anything? Well, I believe that question misses the point of deterrence, and that the proportionality test can still be passed. Certainly, nuclear deterrence threatens a very awful act, but it is a threat, it is not an act. And if that threat can prevent or dissuade a nuclear attack and the devastation which would follow, then it seems to me that the proportionality test is passed with flying colours. We threaten something awful, precisely in order not to have to carry out that threat. Of course, if it is wrong to do evil, then it must be wrong to threaten to do evil. But I think that real-world ethics are rarely as monochrome as that. The world of nuclear deterrence demonstrates to me that intention does not necessarily have the same moral quality as the action with which it is associated. If moral people intend a good result, the prevention of nuclear war, then it seems to me that evil on one side of the balance could be outweighed by good on the other. Michael Walzer, the eminent just war philosopher, has put this better than I can. He said, "We threaten evil in order not to do it, and the doing of it would be so terrible that the threat seems in comparison morally defensible." Second, if I can go on, I'm going to propose a different version of the good example argument. Rather than dispose of our very limited nuclear weapons stockpile in the almost certainly vain hope that North Korea, Iran, China and so on will be so impressed that they'll follow suit immediately, the example we should set, I think, is that of calm, accountable stewardship of a technology and a weapons system which will be with us for as long as human beings have a memory and can read and can do maths. In what we might call a fallen nuclear world, it is surely ethical for some governments to show that this devastating capability, which, as Lord Robertson said, can never be disinvented or forgotten, can be maintained in special circumstances or for specific tasks and not regarded as simply a big weapon. And finally, if I may, ethical objections to the possession of nuclear weapons are also challenged by an argument put forward by the late Sir Michael Quinlan in his most erudite and accessible study, Thinking About Nuclear Weapons. In calling for a more careful assessment of the moral acceptability of possessing nuclear weapons, Quinlan observed that some limited use of nuclear weapons could serve to deny an aggressor the attainment of intolerable aims without entailing unlimited catastrophe, and so could lead to an outcome that might legitimately be termed successful and worth the costs. Now, I don't in any sense advocate nuclear use, and neither was Quinlan advocating nuclear use. But what I think we should expect, and the point he was trying to prove, is that we need careful ethical assessment rather than impulsive ethical dogma. Not least, of course, because it is conceivable that the leaders of non-nuclear weapon states could draw this conclusion for themselves, articulating their own diplomatic, strategic and moral case for nuclear weapon acquisition. If I may finish with a couple more quick remarks. We already live in a world in which the increasing availability of the materials, the technology and the expertise needed to make nuclear weapons will almost certainly mean more weapons proliferation, regional nuclear arms races, and possibly and disastrously even nuclear use. If you're confident, ladies and gentlemen, that against all the evidence that those trends can be reversed, then you should probably vote against the proposition. If you're confident that against all the evidence, an action on our part in the UK can change the minds of proliferator governments, then again you should also vote against the proposition. But if you believe, as we do on this side of the discussion, that we should deal with the world as it is, however different we would wish it to be, then I think you should vote for the proposition. And even if you're uncertain and are inclined to abstain or completely irritated by the gadget you've been given, then I would urge you to cast your vote in favour of Trident, because uncertainty, your uncertainty as well as mine, is precisely what deterrence is designed to deal with. This is the direction, I think, in which political, strategic and ethical prudence points us. Where nuclear deterrence is concerned, the standard of proof must surely be very, very high before we can contemplate doing away with our force posture. This is, as we've heard, a volatile, uncertain and over-armed world. And yes, we have probably contributed to that. But this is not the time to act as though the world were something different altogether. In this unpredictable world, we should do what we can to avoid being surprised in matters of security and defence. And that means, I think, maintaining a defence posture which covers a broad spectrum of possibilities. I think we need to think broadly and maturely rather than discount certain possibilities because prima facie we find them morally repulsive. Michael Quinlan, if I may return to him finally, once formulated a law of deterrence in relation to nuclear weapons. And it's quoted by Sir David Omand in his recent book, Securing the State. Quinlan said, "What we forecast, we prepare for. What we prepare for, we deter. So what we actually experience by way of events is, alas, what we have not prepared for and will catch us by surprise. Everything I've ever learned about nuclear weapons and about the history of deterrence suggests that surprise and even the faint possibility of it should be avoided at all costs." Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I now invite Ron Robertson's witnesses to join him on the
Can I join
platform.
us? You've got to come up here.
Yes. And we will have an opportunity for cross-examination by the leader of the other team, Professor Sir Michael Park.
10 minutes?
Yes, 10 minutes.
Gentlemen, thank you. Very interesting and, if I may say, very erudite statements. A number of issues I'd be interested to raise. Lord Robertson, I mean, you spoke a lot about deterrence. I mean, what do you think it was that made deterrence stable, in your view, during the Cold War, or during the 50 or 60 years that we've worked on deterrence? I mean, what were the elements of it that you think were so important?
Uncertainty as to the outcome of a major conventional attack. I think there's little doubt that the Soviet Union originally had considerable ambitions under Stalin to extend its control over more and more of Europe, and that almost happened. The creation of the NATO alliance was in response to that. But they believe in nuclear deterrence themselves, and they had to understand that the penalty of going further out with the areas that they had already gained control of would produce unacceptable damage to the motherland.
Do you think they understood it in the same way that we did, more or less?
I think, frankly, they did. I've spoken to politicians in Russia and in the Warsaw Pact. I've spoken to leaders of the strategic rocket forces, their nuclear component, Marshal Sergeyev, who was the Minister of Defence during my time in the Ministry of Defence. I spoke to about it. I think they knew it perfectly well. The knowledge was imperfect. We overestimated their power. In some cases, they underestimated ours. But they understood nuclear deterrence and what the penalty would be if they were to act as aggressor against any of the NATO states.
And were we were aware of many near accidents during this period, or nuclear release or scares on both sides that the deterrents might suddenly have broken down, or problems of miscalculation?
I think certainly in the early days that must undoubtedly have been true. As weapon numbers went down, as sophistication and understanding increased, and as more and more measures like de-alerting and confidence-building measures, hotlines and the like of it took place, I think the chances of these things happening were certainly much reduced, but they had to be built into the equation. But I think both sides handled, the major powers handled their nuclear weapons and their nuclear weapons postures with enormous care. And that's the point, I think, that Lord Mooney was saying, that we train our people, and the Americans train their people, and I believe the Russians do as well, disproportionately, in order that there's not going to be a miscalculation. But there's always a risk that something like that might happen. But given the nature of what would be the outcome, I think it focuses the mind.
Well, and which brings me to the next issue. We talked about, Professor Cornish talked about the numbers. I mean, the fairly high numbers in the world. I think we all agree that there are an awful lot of nuclear weapons out there. What, in your view, gentlemen of the team in general, what in your view is the difference between high and low numbers? I mean, if the numbers are high, is that necessarily more threatening than if the numbers are low? If there are 50,000 weapons out there as opposed to 10,000, is that 5 times more dangerous a world than a world of 10,000?
Well, I'll ask Professor Cornish to deal with the detail, but just let me say that virtually pretty well all of the tactical, the short-range nuclear weapons that were in Europe have now gone. There's about 200 gravity bombs still there, mainly in a symbolic context, in Americans committed to NATO and based in NATO bases. The Russians have got 5,000 tactical nuclear weapons. And when I asked the Russians recently why they had so many, because that poses dangers. These are very short range and they're on hair trigger. A very senior Russian said to me, "We have 17 neighbours." And I said, "What you really mean is you've got one big neighbour, and it's not NATO." And he looked at me and he said, "We have 17 neighbours." They have an awful lot of these weapons and are not going to give any of them up at the moment. But anyway, on the principle of numbers, Paul.
Thanks. I think nobody could make the argument really that a higher number of nuclear warheads around the world, strategic, operational, tactical, whatever, is better than a lower number. And I think we'd all agree in this room that we'd all want to see the success of New START and to see warhead holdings reduce as far as they possibly can. And whether that's 1,000 either side, I don't know. Somewhere around there would be good as far as I can see. But in a sense, it's not really the number of warheads that concerns me most. It's the number of proliferator governments. And I think I also, in my list, showed that since the end of the Cold War, we've got another 3 or 4 known nuclear weapon states. We've got another couple who are on the verge of it, if they're not already there.
So how many nuclear weapon states would you say are now in the world? How many have we got at the moment, would you say?
It's about 10, I think. Yeah.
And how many more likely in the next?
Another 2, and then who knows? Because I think the other problem is that it's, again, not numbers, but it's the availability of the materials and the technology, surely, which is distributed.
So would you agree that the numbers as such, the thousands of weapons, don't necessarily determine the politics of our nuclear world? If there were a world of just 500 weapons, we'd still have 9 or 10 nuclear powers, and the politics between them might be roughly the same.
The trend doesn't suggest that, but I think really the point I'm trying to get across is it's not really the numbers of weapon holdings among as it were, the registered nuclear weapon states that's determining this debate, because these other proliferator countries are making their own minds up and have access to this material, and that's beyond the scope of our control.
Okay. Can I ask a question to Lord Mooney on CASD, on continuous at-sea deterrence? You made the point that it either exists or it doesn't. But what would we lose if we did not maintain continuous at-sea deterrence for the next 10, 20 years? That is, if we give it up, what's to stop us doing it again? If we decided not to maintain continuous at-sea deterrence with a 3 or 4 boat force?
Either a deterrent is a deterrent or it isn't. My argument is that, normally I don't need anything like this. My argument is that it's the presence of an invulnerable deterrent 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, which constitutes a proper strategic deterrent.
And for the next 10 years, against whom?
Against whoever it may be. That's the whole point.
Uncertainty, just anyone. Anyone or no one.
The world is an uncertain place.
Yes. So for 10 years, it could be, 10 years, 20 years, it could be against anyone or no one.
Anyone or no one, exactly. But other people possess the weapons.
And you think there's a possibility that another power out there, of the 9 or 10 that we know of in the world, that one of those might want to attack us out of the blue? That's why we keep continuous at-sea deterrence, that one day one of those powers might decide to attack us without warning in the next 10 or 20 years.
The point is that there is no question of one of them wanting to attack us while we possess a continuous at-sea deterrent. There is no question of it.
Okay. And finally, just 1 minute, can I come back to the moral question that Professor Cornish raised? The difference between the threat and the act, that there is a morality in threatening something that we never intend to do, and that gets us over the proportionality argument. Now, I understand that argument very well. But if we argue that all of our defence and our war-making capacity is legal, and we always say that we can only act within the bounds of what we term to be legality, if we separate the threat from the act in the way that you're suggesting, why doesn't that make the threat less credible? If everyone knows, if we advertise to the world that this is our moral position, why would they believe the threat we make? If we say, well, this is a threat without an act to back it up morally.
Because the nature of deterrence being what it is, it can't be a threat unless you are willing to back it up. That's the whole conundrum, in many ways, of nuclear deterrence and the theological debate that surrounds it. I mean, I've been fascinated by this since I was an undergraduate at St Andrews reading theology, and this is my view. I think it's, as I said, I think it works out for me morally and ethically to take this position.
But if I can put it, in a sense, the threat and the act go closely together, and you're saying that morally, if we separate them, so that we remain legal, to stay on the right side of the proportionality argument, the further away the threat and the act become, the less politically credible the threat is likely to be, isn't it?
I'm not sure I follow your point, Professor, because I think, although we are, of course, notionally separating them, but the threat only has substance insofar as we are threatening an act which we would be willing to carry out.
So we would be willing to carry out the act, which would be disproportionate.
Of course we have to be, but in the process of making that threat, this is the paradox of nuclear deterrence, I understand it. In the process of making that threat, we ensure that we will not have to carry out the act. That is how it wins.
If your belief is correct.
Yes.
All right.
Can I just add a little to that, since I had responsibility for those aspects of things, and when I took over at the Ministry of Defence, and given my background, a file is put in front of you, the door is closed and locked, and you're told that you have to read it all, and that's the targeting sort of potential. None of the missiles are targeted, but there are scenarios, as there are on the other side as well. So we talk about mutual assured destruction as if we're really talking about the 1950s and the 1960s. As you know only too well, all weapons have become much more accurate, much more sophisticated. So, a nuclear response does not need to mean Armageddon. That is, you are not talking about pulling a trigger and destroying the whole of the world. But your adversary knows that you can inflict huge damage, especially on their ability to continue with an attack if it is taking place. So I think that's where the proportionality can come in. But at the end of the day, you are trying to give a signal that your adversary cannot win a conventional war. A Hitler Hitler cannot possibly think that he can dominate the world in conventional ways, as he almost did during the 1940s. And secondly, you are giving the signal to the other side, and they to you, that if something happens, that you can inflict considerable damage, perhaps on their military, but even wider if that was going to be the only way in which it could be done. But, the moral arguments that aside, we have got to the stage where nuclear weapons exist, and people like me who are elected have got to sit and take responsibility.
Indeed.
A heavy one.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Now, we'll turn now to the case for Team B, and I'll invite Professor Clark to make his opening statement for that team.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't in any way denigrate the responsibilities of power that politicians have to take, or the sincerity of all of those who argue about these issues. We've all been around this boy so many times. We've done this. We've grown up with these arguments, and we've read all the stuff many, many times. I think one of the things that's different is that those of us on the abolitionist side of the fence were always regarded by and large as soft-hearted sentimentalists who didn't have a really hard-edged political aspect to offer, and the pro-deterrent camp were always regarded as the realists. It seems to me that now it's actually the other way around. I find that within the maintenance camp there's a lack of really hard-edged thinking, which I think we've heard some of tonight, and I would like to point that out to you. Our side of the argument is based on what I would like to take down to the fundamentals. And the reason I wanted to ask Lord Robertson about deterrence, he spent a lot of time talking about that, and his witnesses did as well. It comes down to a belief in the viability of the concept of nuclear deterrence. That's the fundamental. And this concept of nuclear deterrence, first of all, during the Cold War, we got through it. It was not as safe as we thought it was, and I think we agree on that. But we have got through it. We shouldn't be churlish about that. But we now know, with the benefit of hindsight, that there were more scares than we would have liked to have thought. As late as the mid-1980s, indeed, when some of the wrong tapes were put into the PSYOP at Omaha, Nebraska. But more than that, more importantly, as Lord Robertson agreed, the deterrence we had during the Cold War was based on some pretty unique historical circumstances. First of all, there were two sides. They understood each other. They talked the same deterrent language. They had command and control. They controlled their forces pretty well. If they wanted to use them, if they'd pressed the button, they would have worked, and if they didn't press the button, they didn't go off by accident. They had control over their allies. They came from the same Judeo-Christian tradition. There was roughly the same sense of morality and proportionality, and I'm sure that the Russians had the same sorts of moral arguments that we had during the 50s and 60s. And above all, there were two players. My proposition is that at the end of the Cold War, I will concede, for the sake of this argument, that deterrence worked in the Cold War. I actually don't believe it, but I will concede for this argument that it did work in the Cold War. I actually think it was a carrots in the high street argument, that you scatter carrots in the high street to keep the elephants away, and somebody says, well, there's no elephants in the high street, and you say, well, it proves the carrots work. That's my own view. But for the purpose of this debate, let me say it worked during the Cold War. The situation now is completely different, because we're looking at, let's say, 9 nuclear powers that we know of. That is, there are 5 accepted nuclear powers. Then there's Israel, Pakistan, India. That's 8. North Korea, that's 9. Iran will join that list probably by about 2015. So we're heading for 9 or 10. And the sort of deterrence we're heading for is not between 2 players, but between 2 or 3 or 4, between India and Pakistan, and India and China and Russia. And that they will have different cultural bases. It's not clear to me that they will think of deterrence in this very rationalistic way that it was thought about during the Cold War. It's not clear to me that deterrence is somehow a fact of life that we all agree on. It's not clear to me that leaderships around the world share the same view of rationalism. And I'll give you just one example of that. We're doing quite a lot of work at the moment on Chinese thinking about nuclear weapons. China is a nuclear power, and there's quite a lot of evidence that the Chinese think quite differently about deterrence. Henry Kissinger, no lack of realism him, Henry Kissinger in his book on China points this out. He says that the Chinese view of deterrence is not based on uncertainty, it's based on certainty. If you look at the way they deter North Vietnam, it was by invading them in 1979. They announced what they were going to do and when they were going to do it, and then they did it. They smacked them, and then they moved back, and they said, that's deterrence. The same with India in 1962. The Chinese have a sense that if you want deterrence, you actually announce your intentions, you carry them out,
and then you carry out deterrence. It's not about uncertainty. When China thinks about deterrence, it's about certainty. So it's not clear to me that we can move forward in this world thinking that deterrence is somehow a fact of life. My second point of critique of this view of natural stability, some sort of natural balance there, is that I don't think nuclear deterrence was ever a deduced strategy. It was always a rationalization, and it always meant whatever we said it meant. And again, I'll offer you some examples. When the nuclear technology was only good enough to hit cities, we said, oh, it's a counter-city strategy. That's good for deterrence. We can completely destroy each other's cities, therefore it's terrible, therefore we won't do it, that's good for deterrence. When the technology was good enough just to target forces, not cities, but actual other forces, we said, no, that's better for deterrence, because we don't have to do something terrible, we only have to do something a little bit terrible, destroy their other forces, therefore we're more likely to do it, that's good for deterrence. Forget what we said before, what we say now is deterrence. Similarly, mutually assured destruction. Let's destroy each other, that's good for deterrence. But once we got to the point of saying we want flexible response, we want smaller and smaller nuclear weapons because we can have them, suddenly, no, that's good for deterrence because it gives us more rungs on the escalation ladder, makes it more usable, more likely. We used to say that ballistic missile defense was bad for deterrence. Any technology which allowed us to defend against incoming missiles was bad for deterrence because it actually undermined mutually assured destruction. But when ballistic missile defense becomes a reality, as it now does, we say, no, it's good for deterrence because it means that some weapons will survive, therefore you'll be able to hit back, therefore it's good for deterrence. Deterrence is whatever we say it is, and that's what's so frustrating to those of us who've been following it for the last 30 or 40 years. And in Britain, we've done exactly the same. When the strategic arms limitation talks were underway in the 1960s, 1970s, we said, it doesn't apply to our weapons, because our weapons are not strategic, they're tactical, because they're targeted on weapons concentrations in Eastern Europe, which they were. And when the intermediate nuclear force, tactical nuclear weapons forces, INF talks were going on in Europe, when we were talking about reducing tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, we said the opposite. We said, this doesn't apply to our weapons, because they're strategic. So we found rationales to keep our weapons out of the discussion all the time. And again, minimum deterrence. When we had 250 warheads, we said, that's minimum, absolute minimum. When we had V-bombers, that's minimum. We don't have V-bombers now, we have 150-odd weapons, that's minimum. Minimum is whatever we say it is. It's a bit like talking about hard-working families. You know, when you're coming up to an election, that we don't have any lazy families in this country, we only have hard-working families. So our deterrent is always minimum. Whatever we say it is, it's minimum. There is a sense in which all of this argument is unprovable, it's purely inductive, none of it is deductive, and in fact it is instinctive. The real reasons that we have nuclear weapons are a combination of lots of things. Our instinct that if we can produce them, we should, and that instinct goes back to the 1940s. Our instinct that if we have nuclear weapons, we are more credible with the United States, and that is true. Our instinct that it gives us some sort of military prestige in the world, and that is true. Our instinct that if we have nuclear weapons, it's easier for us to hold on to our seat in the permanent five of the United Nations, and that's true. Our instinct that the French have nuclear weapons, so we should have nuclear weapons. France should not be the only nuclear power in Europe, and that's sort of true. Our instinct that it's about jobs, it's about technology, it's about the public opinion sense that if other nations have a nuclear weapon, we should have one too. All of those are instinctive arguments. And I'm a political realist. They're all partly true, but none of them are deeply strategic. And so my challenge is, put all of those arguments together. It's about prestige, it's about technology, it's about jobs, it's about France, it's about the United States, it's about the UN. Put all of them together, multiply them by 10, and then ask yourself, is this worth having a weapon that will kill tens of thousands of innocent people that we've never met in another country because some leadership has miscalculated? Is that the moral compass of what we're trying to do? Reduce it down to fundamentals. And I say to the other side of this argument, justify that. Try to justify that. I understand why we have nuclear weapons. I'm a political analyst. I know what these justifications are, but none of them seem to me to be about stable deterrence, which I think is a misnomer. I think it's astrology. It's a chimera that we pursue. My final point is that I think we have a window of opportunity which opened to us quite unjustifiably in the late 1990s, and will probably close somewhere around the 2020s, of doing something about nuclear weapons. The genie is not so far out of the bottle. We've got 9 or 10 nuclear weapon states in the world, not 20 or 30. When we've got 20 or 30 or 40, then the genie will be right out of the bottle. We've got 9 or 10. And between now and 2020, it is possible to conceive of a much more highly restricted nuclear world. Probably not global zero, I fully accept that. But a world in which nuclear weapons are much more highly restricted as opposed to more on a free-for-all basis. And 2015, it seems to me, represents a quite interesting turning point. In 2015, we'll probably have two newly elected presidents in the United States and in Russia. Right? Two presidents who will feel that they've got some legitimacy behind them. And Obama may then be deep into his second term thinking about his legacy. In 2015, we will have reached the brick wall of the Iran crisis. The Iranians will be at the nuclear threshold or will be crossing the nuclear threshold. And there will be a sense of manifest crisis about proliferation in the world because of that. We will probably have a British election in 2015, maybe a bit before, but probably not until 2015. And then in 2016, we take the decision about going ahead with Trident replacement in 2016. So it seems to me that there is a moment that we're coming up to in this last period where the window of opportunity to restrict nuclear weapons is still open to us. We're coming up to a period where things might change quite quickly over the next 4 or 5 years if we can grasp the opportunities. Which is where Britain's role comes in, and by implication also France's role, although it's a different argument in France. The numbers are irrelevant, but it seems to me that Britain and Britain's nuclear weapons can be a force either for bad or for good in this argument. If Britain, with no palpable enemies at the moment, safer than we've ever been in our history before, with the argument of mere uncertainty ahead of us, if we say we have to have nuclear weapons, then everybody has to have them. If mere uncertainty is the argument, then we ought to be building hospitals against the possibility of a new Black Death, of H5N1 mutating to become a new Great Plague. If uncertainty is the only argument, we ought to be massively investing in environmental degradation, because that looks as if it's on the horizon. Mere uncertainty seems to me to be not a particularly good argument for saying that we have to carry on with this particular policy if we think that it is poor policy. But equally, Britain's role could be a role for good, because I think if we scrapped Trident, it would be the most significant nuclear decision that the world had ever seen. And of course, others won't follow that example. They won't follow that example. I fully accept that point. But a reversal of that would actually indicate that the United Kingdom was getting out of an unstable, multiple deterrent scenario. Deterrence is going to become multiple. It is going to become, I'm pretty sure, fairly unstable, and I think we can move away from that. So the fundamental question is, do we want to be one nuclear power in a world of 30 or 40, because Britain's nuclear programme and the arguments it creates makes it much more likely that we'll have a world of 30 or 40 at some point. So do we want to be one of 30 or 40? Or do we want to be a non-nuclear power in a more highly restricted world of maybe 3 or 4, where we can play some role in the restrictions? That's an alternative possibility. And I don't duck away from what I know they're talking about over there. Supposing we gave up our nuclear weapons and it had no effect whatsoever on anybody else, and we were a non-nuclear power in a world of 30 or 40 nuclear powers, would we still be better off? And I would say yes. Most people in America who carry guns are much more likely to get shot than if they don't carry guns. I'm not making that as a direct comparison. I use it to illustrate the argument that just because the world has 30 or 40 nuclear powers in it doesn't necessarily mean that we're safer having one. I invite you to think about that relationship. The issue is, should we get out of a fraudulent deterrence game? And in the next 2 or 3 years, we have the opportunity in Britain to think about that, and the opportunity actually for once in our history to take a big step and get rid of a weapon system which is irrelevant to our future and actually has risks built into the continuation of it. So I invite you to oppose the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Clark, I now invite you to call your first witness.
Thank you. I'd like to call Nick Ritchie. You're right. Sorry. So I'd like to call Nick Ritchie. And Nick, if you just explain to us a little bit about your background.
Yes, thank you, Mike. My name's Nick Ritchie. I'm a research fellow at the Department of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford. Many years ago now, I did my PhD on US nuclear weapons policy and its evolution after the Cold War. And for the last 3 or so years, I've been looking in some detail at British nuclear weapons policy following the decision to begin this process of replacing the current Trident system.
Thank you. And we've talked a lot, I've talked a bit, and the opposition side, the other side have talked quite a lot about uncertainty. What would you say are the utility of Britain's nuclear weapons for the next 20 or 30 years?
Thank you. I'll just begin with giving a conundrum as I see it to the audience. And the conundrum is this. If Trident is a £25 billion answer, what is the question? I've been looking for the question, and I've been unable to find one that justifies retaining Trident as a £25 billion answer. In terms of this idea of uncertainty and how we think about using our nuclear weapons, and as our other speakers have said, if we're going to have nuclear weapons, if we're going to buy into the logic of deterrence, we must plan to use them. That is where the credibility of nuclear deterrence lies. So, the mantra for retaining nuclear weapons is national security. But we've got to be quite clear about the circumstances in which we would consider using these nuclear weapons, so we don't swallow this national security medicine without question. Now, we have, as a government, formally declared that we will only use, or we will not use or threaten to use our nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states that are party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, providing that such states are in full compliance with their treaty obligations. Now, this covers the huge majority of countries, every country in the world, as we've heard, bar about 8 or 9, maybe 10. Furthermore, we have legally codified that assurance for nearly 100 of the world's countries through our ratification of 3 nuclear weapon-free zones covering all of Latin America and the Caribbean, the South Pacific and Africa. That legal assurance will increase by another 15 countries should we sign and ratify 2 more nuclear weapon-free zones covering Central Asia and Southeast Asia. Second, we've accepted, as a government, the judgment of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion from 1996. They issued an advisory opinion on this question, on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. Now, the court stated that the rules of humanitarian law applicable in armed conflict are fundamental and constitute intransgressible principles of international customary law, including the use of force in self-defence. Now, the Geneva Conventions, which form the core of international humanitarian law, have been ratified long since by the UK. And the court's advisory opinion concluded that, and I quote, "The threat or use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to the rules of international law, and in particular, the principles and rules of humanitarian law that are applicable in armed conflict." And this is because of the destructive blast, incendiary and radiation effects of nuclear weapons that can't be contained in time or space. But the court also concluded, that it could not conclude definitively whether the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful in extreme circumstances of self-defence in which the very survival of the state would be at stake. Now, the UK as a government does not dispute that international humanitarian law applies to the use of nuclear weapons. And we have since incorporated this notion of extreme circumstances of self-defence into our nuclear policy statements. So, the purpose of this is to highlight that by our own hand, the conditions under which we would use or threaten to use our nuclear weapons, based on these political and legal commitments, are extremely limited. They are essentially confined to responding to a devastating strategic attack, most likely a nuclear attack, against us or our allies that threaten the very survival of the state. So this is the very narrow frame of reference we must use when judging the supposed security benefits of retaining strategic nuclear weapons. And we must ask how likely it is that such conditions may arise and whether it's worth the cost. And underpinning this is a fundamental truism, that there are no risk-free nuclear worlds. If we retain Trident, we do not live in a risk-free nuclear world. And as speakers on the other side have said, even if we arrive at a nuclear weapons-free world, that will still contain risks. But there are no risk-free nuclear futures. I'll just say something now on this issue of uncertainty. Supporters of Trident and supporters of our remaining a nuclear weapon state say that we cannot know what the future holds, and sure enough, we can't. So we absolutely must retain nuclear weapons, the argument goes, just in case, as an insurance against future uncertainty. But we must be wary of this argument, because when proponents talk of insurance, they suggest a guarantee of protection against major attack. But Trident offers no such guarantee. What Trident does represent is the potential ability, not an assured ability, to counter a very specific set of highly improbable contingencies that would involve a devastating attack against us or our allies, probably with nuclear weapons. That's the most that can be claimed from this insurance analogy that's often used. So Trident does not provide an insurance against broader threats to our vital interests, as is often claimed or suggested. Vital interests that are sure to be challenged in this uncertain international security environment we find ourselves in. The Falklands crisis and many others demonstrate that the vital interests of states can be transgressed irrespective of whether those states possess nuclear weapons or not. And we will face a whole range of transnational, national, subnational security threats arising from these uncertainties and instabilities of the world we're in. And it's tempting to look to the apparent certainties of nuclear deterrence for comfort, but it's a false comfort. Nuclear deterrence offers no certainty, and our nuclear weapons provide no solution that I can see to the vulnerabilities we will face from the types of conflict and the types of security challenges resulting from this very diverse set of insecurities that we currently face and will continue to face. I'll say something about cost, if I may. As has been noted, the government's cost estimates in 2006, when the decision was made by the Blair government to begin this process of replacing Trident, were between 15 and 20 billion for the whole lot, replacing the submarines, new infrastructure, warheads, and potentially new missiles. Those costs were reaffirmed by the government, the current coalition government, in May. Part of that, 11 to 14 billion in 2006 prices, is for the submarines. That's going to be about 25 billion in what they call out-term prices when the money's actually spent, about 25 billion. Others have suggested, because the MOD has proven itself incapable in many situations of bringing major equipment projects on time and budget, that could be closer to 30 or 35 billion. But in either event, MOD can't afford it. It's been widely publicised that the Ministry faces a major funding shortfall in its future equipment budget of up to 36 billion over the next 10 years. Its budget is being cut by 7.5% over this Parliament under the 2010 Comprehensive Spending Review. This comes after cuts made at the end of 2008 and at the end of December 2009. Then we had a huge range of difficult decisions, more cuts in last October's Defence Review. And now the Ministry is undertaking another 3-month review to report in July to consider how more personnel, more equipment programmes may have to be tailored or axed to save several more billion. Now, in 2006, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, stated that the Trident replacement programme would not be at the expense of conventional capabilities our armed forces need. That promise was greeted with some scepticism at the time. And following the announcement last July by the Chancellor, George Osborne, that MOD will have to find the money out of its own budget for replacing the Trident submarines, then Blair's promise is now impossible to uphold. Expenditure on Trident replacement will come at the expense of conventional capabilities. So, we clearly don't have a crystal ball. We can't rule out categorically some 1940 dreadful security situation. But looking at the world now and the types of challenges we face, how the world has been transformed after the Cold War, those circumstances are now sufficiently remote as to very seriously question the necessity and the opportunity costs of our continued possession of nuclear weapons. We can accept that history is full of surprises, but just because we can imagine future scenarios doesn't mean they're worthy of policy planners' time. Uncertainty must be considered within the context of an environment where some significant security threats and challenges are relatively clear. There are contingencies, like the effects of climate change, that we know we're going to need to plan for. And it's difficult to see how the UK's possession of nuclear weapons relates to these sorts of security considerations. So the question becomes, is it absolutely necessary to retain a nuclear capability at the cost envisaged that MOD can ill afford for the very limited potential security benefits on offer? Because we think that nuclear weapons give us a vague, unquantifiable influence in the world above and beyond all our other national assets that we clearly have? The answer for me is no. They are not necessary. They are an optional extra that comes at significant financial, moral and political cost. And in my view, it's time for us to put away our nuclear security blanket and move on.
Nick, can I just ask you one question before you go? On the costs, the long-term lifetime costs, maybe 4% of the defence budget, which you'd say is over a 30-year time span, is reasonably affordable. What's the problem with costs? Why can't we afford 4% over 30 years?
Well, it's more likely, it looks like it's going to be more than 4%. It might end up being 6-7%. But the fact is that the costs come out of the MOD's budget, and there is a strong sense from the Strategic Defence Review and from previous budgets, from previous reviews, that the armed forces are not getting the capabilities they need for the types of missions we wish them to undertake. And therefore, Blair's promise that replacing Trident would not come at the expense of conventional capabilities isn't going to be met if those costs are going to come out of MOD's core budget. So again, it comes down to political judgment.
So your point now is that the opportunity costs in other forces, in terms of the other forces, is now becoming acute. It's not an abstraction anymore.
Given the acute financial pressures that MOD is feeling, yes, that has become a much more important issue to consider. I mean, it's wrong when people argue that if we don't spend the money on Trident, then we can build 3 new hospitals, because the Chancellor won't take that money out of the MOD budget and spend it on other things like that. It'll go elsewhere. But MOD is now having to spend out of its own hide on Trident replacement, and so that money could be spent on other things.
Okay. Nick, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And our second witness is the Right Reverend Richard Holloway. And I wanted to ask Richard about your sense of the way in which our Trident decisions, our stance, equates to the moral and ethical standards that we set ourselves in the way we define our defence policy and our decisions to go to war. How would you define that? Sorry, would you say a little bit about yourself?
Yes, my name is Richard Holloway, former Bishop of Edinburgh and a kind of amateur theologian. And what I want to reflect on is the ethics,
than the rest of us.
the ethics of deterrence based on an interpretation of just war theory, which is something that Christianity evolved as a way of trying to limit the reckless destruction that we do to one another. Just war theory comes in 2 parts, jus ad bellum and jus in bello. The reasons for going to war must be just, and once entered, war itself must be justly waged. We know, of course, that the worst thing about war is that once entered, it achieves a demonic energy all its own, but that's no reason why we should not seek to tame and control its conduct as much as we can. If a war is to be justly entered, according to the theory, it has to be the last resort for a righteous cause, legally authorized and with a realistic prospect of success. And when it's being waged, it must be waged proportionately and respect civilian immunity. It will be seen immediately how difficult it is to apply just war theory with any precision to modern high-tech war fighting. With the advent of nuclear weapons, the whole theory altered dramatically. It was now possible to inflict maximum casualties at the beginning of the war, hence the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the doctrine of deterrence. Just let me add a kind of sidebar here. I think that the doctrine of deterrence is a bit like the existence of God. There are good arguments for and against it, but I suspect that most of us arrive at a position intestinally, and we use the arguments as intellectualizations of more deeply existentially held feelings. So let me now rehearse some of my own intestinal reactions to it. I want to offer two reflections based on two questions. First, what can the ethics of just war theory say about the nuclear deterrence scenario? And secondly, are there any specific ethical considerations that should colour our approach to Britain's deterrent and Trident in particular, which is the version we now have? As far as just war theory applied to nuclear war goes, it will be immediately obvious that a nuclear war could never fulfill the criteria, as the title of the deterrent theory eloquently telegraphs, mutually assured destruction. There would be no winners, only losers, including a dramatically damaged planet. If waging a nuclear war would be wrong, is the threat of waging it wrong? If it assures us that it will never happen, a position eloquently rehearsed by the other team. I believe it is. I believe the threat to do something monstrous is itself monstrous. Not as monstrous as doing it, but pretty monstrous at the same time. There are lots of utilitarian arguments against the deterrent, and we've had them rehearsed eloquently by my side. The clearest being the risks of nuclear proliferation, the fact that there's a metaphysical aspect to the theory that it probably doesn't really deter. The paradox is, the more countries that want the deterrent because they believe the arguments of the deterrers, the more likely it is one day to cease to deter. That's why the so-called great powers are committed to radical reduction solutions. But that is not the heart of my moral objection. You may believe the threat works and keeps the peace, and maybe it does. But I think the threat itself is immoral. If I have a large, noisy family living next door to me, and I'm sufficiently frightening and intimidating in my demeanour to put it off, I might keep them quiet by threatening to rape their children, but I would not want peace at that price. I do not want to be the kind of person that makes that kind of threat, nor do I want my country to be the kind of country that threatens to annihilate another country in the name of a metaphysical theory called deterrence. One of the glories of our humanity is that there have always been individuals who would rather submit to death than compromise certain fundamental values. Indeed, this is one of the glories of the military ethic, and I think it applies here. I know it's easy to say these things and harder to do them, but if we are to step slowly and carefully back from the precipice we have slid towards, I think we have to begin by telling ourselves that we do not want to be the kind of people who threaten these things, and that moral revulsion, the moral revulsion we feel about making monstrous threats, might supply the energy we need to get ourselves out of the situation in which we find ourselves. But I think something else has to be said, something specifically about the British deterrent. And I believe the British factor actually muddles the purity of the deterrence theory, beautifully argued by the other side tonight. It's obvious from the record that there were profound non-military factors in Britain's decision to go down the nuclear road. Let me offer 3 examples from the record. The most famous example is provided by Prime Minister Clement Attlee's Cabinet Committee on October the 25th, 1946, when they discussed whether Britain should become a nuclear power or not. This is what Dennis Rickett's Cabinet minutes recorded. In discussion, it was urged that we must consider seriously whether we could afford to divert from civilian consumption and the restoration of our balance of payments the economic resources required for a project on this scale. Unless present trends were reversed, we might find ourselves faced with an extremely serious economic and financial situation in 2 or 3 years. On the other hand, it was argued that our prestige in the world would suffer if we did not exploit to the full a discovery in which we played a leading part at the outset. The historian Peter Hennessy describes this as the great power impulse, and it was also present when in 1954 Lord Plowden went to see Churchill to brief him on the costs of developing and manufacturing nuclear bombs. Churchill told him, "We must do it. It's the price we pay to sit at the top table." And here to bring it right up to date is a line from Tony Blair's memoir, A Journey. "I could see clearly the force of the common sense and practical arguments against Trident. Yet, in the final analysis, I thought giving it up too big a downgrading of our status as a nation." I suspect that behind all the doctrinal disputes that surround this issue and all the claims and counterclaims about its strategic effectiveness, once politicians get into power, the prestige argument, however unconsciously, overrides all other perspectives, which is why so many Labour politicians who used to parade to ban the bomb now parade to keep it. I heard a former political advisor to Tony Blair put the argument to retraining Trident like this: if we give up Trident, we'll be like Belgium. Well, I don't think that's a fate worse than death myself. To sum up, I am aware of the danger and delicacy of undoing the situation that we've got ourselves into. While I believe that the threat of using these weapons is itself immoral, I'm not naive enough to believe we can rush to dismantle our arsenals without consideration of all the factors involved. But I believe that dismantling the British deterrent would pose little threat to the balance of terror and might encourage others to do likewise. But even if it didn't, it's still, I believe, the moral thing to do. I suspect the reason for not doing so is a kind of nostalgic vanity for the days when we bestrode the world like a colossus. Frankly, I'm glad those days are over, and I think we're a better country as a result. We don't need to keep this astronomically expensive prestige item to console ourselves for losing an empire. We'll be better off financially and morally, I believe, without it. That's my argument against the existence of God.
Thank you. Richard, you've thought more than most. You've thought more than most of us, I guess, in this room about the dilemmas of providing a moral lead and the viability of providing a moral lead. You addressed the point very clearly toward the end. You said even if nobody else followed immediately, it is still the right thing to do. Would you just expand on that a little bit? I mean, and in what way do moral leads, what is the benefit of a moral lead if there is no immediate reaction to it?
Well, I think some things you do because they're the right thing to do. I don't think all conduct should be based on kind of opportunistic prudence. I think that most of us in the real world, and I take the arguments, we have to negotiate these things carefully. But I think that there are things so monstrous that no utilitarian argument would justify them. I think there are utilitarian indications that making this grand moral gesture wouldn't greatly endanger the nation, but I believe passionately enough that even if it did put it as some kind of risk, I think it's a risk worth taking. I think evil is contagious. I think goodness is also contagious. And I think that if we as a nation unilaterally did this, apart from the money we would save, and I'm not giving financial arguments for it, because I think the nub of the moral argument is about the moral content of the threat itself. And I think that doing that might make others think, but even if it didn't, I still think it's the right thing to do.
And your argument on deterrence, deterrence is inherent in human relationships. People deter each other every day of the week in Tesco's and so on. But your point is that nuclear deterrence, or deterrence by use of weapons of mass destruction, is inherently immoral.
I think so, because it's not, there's no relativity to it. There's no calculus of balancing good against evil, a lesser evil. We know that war is always an evil, but we morally argue that sometimes it's the lesser of evils. The trouble with war, of course, it assumes its own dynamic. I think there's no way that you can apply this, although I mean, the professor over there gave a very eloquent argument on the other side. And as I say, it's a bit like the existence of God. It's what you feel inside. I feel this is wrong in itself, but I'm also persuaded that it doesn't really work. And I don't think that we would make the world an unsafer place if we gave it up. I think we might give the world a little push in maybe a more radically, rather reckless direction in doing good. But I think sometimes doing good, you have to sacrifice a certain kind of prudence.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Now, can I ask the witnesses for Team B to the platform and give Lord Robertson the opportunity to cross-examine? You ready?
Michael, if deterrence is a chimera, you very eloquently said it was whatever anybody said it was. So it's really not deterrence at all. It's deterrence in that. So are you in favour of America unilaterally giving up all its nuclear weapons today, even if nobody else did?
I'm in favour of America going in for a highly restricted version of its nuclear arsenal. So America, Russia, probably China, are the three countries that you could argue have some sort of superpower right to weapons for the foreseeable future. It wouldn't bother me greatly, in terms of would America be hugely vulnerable if it gave up its nuclear weapons. I'd actually say probably not. Probably not.
But because
it has huge conventional capabilities in its sense. If anybody threatened the United States in nuclear terms, the United States is conventionally hugely capable, and that in itself is almost that's a historical case.
Well,
that in itself is almost a balance.
Let me shift the goalpost then slightly. Do you think that the Russian Federation should, without any reciprocation, give up its nuclear weapons at the moment?
I don't think it will, but I would not be. I would like it if it. I would be happy if it did, because I don't think it would be vulnerable. I assume you mean to Chinese threats. I actually don't see how it would work out between Russia and China.
You mentioned that China believes in walloping things.
Yeah.
Say what you're going to do it, and then pull back. You think they might do that to Russia if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons?
I think they'd find different ways of doing it. If you had a nuclear power on one side and a non-nuclear power on another, I don't think the Chinese would cross that red line for the sake of their sense of deterrence. But I think they would cross that red line in other ways, in conventional ways. I come back to my belief that these deterrent relationships are actually ephemeral. I don't think they dictate policy and policy choices when it comes down to it.
So you don't.
I accept the politicians believe that, and if they believe that, there's some reality to that. But I think if you posit a world in which one power had nuclear weapons and others didn't, I don't think that would be an inherently unstable world. But I think there'd be other ways of counteracting.
But you pointed out that China, invaded Vietnam and pulled back. Vietnam does not have nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
China has not invaded North Korea. And it has not suggested invading India since India got nuclear weapons. Does that not tend to suggest that there is an element of deterrence built into the fact that a nuclear state against a non-nuclear state produces a different dynamic?
I think that would be grossly overstated, personally. I don't see the deterrent logic in that. I honestly don't see it. Now, I know politicians talk about it.
Just a coincidence that they haven't in any way tried to...
Well, because I don't think the world politics haven't led them to that decision. Or
They have a huge number of border disputes with India on the northern India-China border, but there was no talk, suggestion, or declaration by the Communist Party of China that they would actually sort of do something about it militarily.
No, I still think I don't think that the fact that both of them are nuclear powers would actually have the effect of stopping the Chinese from engaging in military activity with India if they wanted to, because I think they're very well aware of where these thresholds are perceived to be.
Right. Well, so the argument is they are not being deterred at all.
Yes,
nuclear weapons have no deterrent effect at all.
I think they have a minimal deterrent. They have some deterrent effect in the minds of policymakers, but I don't believe that there is a hard reality to that.
Let me ask the former bishop, if I can. We just call you Mr. Holloway, do we, Richard?
Richard is fine, yeah.
Yeah, that's it, yeah. Well,
They didn't unfrock me, I'm still a bishop.
What's that? Oh. I don't know whether it's because we're in the Royal Society of Edinburgh that we've become so terribly formal that we've forgotten first names, but to do with that. But, you know, you gave an impassioned view about the evil nature of nuclear weapons. Indeed, it sounded as though you were actually arguing against all weapons, because there are, of course, non-nuclear weapons that can inflict huge amounts of damage as well. So where's the line?
I think the line is proportionate. I'm not a pacifist. I'm almost a pacifist. I think that there aren't very many wars that I think can be justified on rational moral grounds. One or two. We've had non-stop wars since we invented the deterrent anyway. It hasn't deterred any of those. And I think that modern industrial warfare, given the impact it has on civilian populations, is actually quite difficult to justify. But no, I'm not a pacifist, but I believe that the qualitative and quantitative difference between nuclear weapons and conventional weapons is so massive that it makes the argument for war, which is to make maybe a bad thing slightly better, to alter a situation slightly for the better, because we never get perfection in these things. I think clearly a nuclear war would not do any of those things, which is why the argument is that it's the threat to use them, and you hedge your bets, you reserve in your own mind in some compartment the knowledge that you may not use them, that you would not use them, but you believe that the threat in fact deters. I think that's a perfectly valid argument. I just don't happen to think that it's a moral thing to do. I'm not even sure that that's as effective as people make out. But I think that the argument from proportionality, obviously cluster bombing is more dangerous proportionally than bow and arrows. And one of the problems with human cleverness is that we've achieved over the centuries ever more reckless and kind of broad ways of destroying each other. And I think that we've now reached the ultimate with this one. If we ever actually did get into a war with this, I think we would so seriously degrade the planet that there would be no logic in doing it at all. There may be a logic in threatening to do it if you believe it actually stops the thing happening. That's the argument. I don't believe it, and that's the difference between us.
So there have been lots and lots of wars. There have been no nuclear wars. No use of a nuclear weapon since 1945. Not a single use of a nuclear weapon since 1945. Is that a coincidence as well?
It could well be a coincidence. It could be like the scattered carrots. I don't know. This is why I think it comes down to a judgment that's partly moral and partly a kind of intuition. I also think, though, that if you carry the logic of deterrence completely, then every country in the world should have. I mean, Iran, I can understand Iran's argument for having getting a nuclear deterrent because its enemies have them as well. And so it seems to me that the very argument itself becomes weakened the more countries that have it.
Well, I'll let the former theology student have a go at the bishop. The as yet unfrocked bishop.
Thank you. Thank
evening,
you.
Professor.
Thank you, Lord Robertson, I think. I'll just pick up, if I could, Richard, on the last comment you just made about Iran, because I don't actually think I've seen much in Iran's declarations of intent as far as its nuclear aspirations are concerned that has anything to do with achieving a position of mutual deterrence with anyone. Most, if not all, of the declarations I've ever read about Iran's nuclear aspirations concern Israel and the annihilation thereof.
Yeah.
So where's the mutuality in that?
Yeah. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that. I mean, I think the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons has destabilized that whole area and inevitably has provoked this kind of response in other countries. I think my argument tonight was specifically aimed at the British nuclear deterrent. I think it would be very difficult to unpick the whole mosaic of deterrence throughout the world. But I think that you can gradate it. I think you can. There are elements of proportionality involved here, and I think that the British, the Trident deterrent is itself less potent an element in that mosaic than some of the others. I don't see how we could ever unpick the thing without doing it very, very carefully indeed. And so I'm with my leader on that particular area of the debate.
Can I come in just on one thought, because it's an important point. Iran wants a nuclear weapon. Any government in Iran wants a nuclear weapon, and the regime change in Iran isn't going to change that. We understand that. And it's conceivable that you would conceive of an Iranian-Israeli relationship that would look deterrent-wise, and it would look like two powers deterring each other from the annihilation of one. You could conceive of that. But if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, we're quite likely to see a Middle East with 4 or 5 other powers, Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Egypt, and even one or two of the Gulf states might want to go for nuclear weapons. And we'd quite quickly be in a situation of a multiple deterrent, where politicians would be trying to operate some sort of very complex multiple deterrent relationship. And my argument would be that wouldn't be a safer Middle East, so that our interest is in doing all we can to get out of this deterrent game in the Middle East, to do something else about Iranian possession of nuclear weapons.
Thanks, Mike. Can I just ask one other follow-up question? I mean, to Richard again. This argument about the rightness and wrongness of acting and threatening and so on, as you said, the utilitarian argument and so on, this has been around in the ethics of nuclear deterrence since Paul Ramsey, since the 1960s and so on. This is a very long-standing debate, as we all know. But I have to say, surprised by the position you've taken, because I think you are conflating the threat and the act. You are seeing them pretty much as the same thing. And I think I'm going to ask you whether you can't accept that the prospect of a nuclear war is really so considerably evil, to use the terms we've used this evening, so considerably unbearably evil that one would almost be justified in doing anything in order to prevent that. Surely there is that balance. Surely you can see that a utilitarian argument can obtain in this case.
Sure, if you think it's actually working. I mean, my argument for the British deterrent, in a sense, is compartmentalised from the total deterrent argument. And I think that the point I made at the end, the prestige element in Britain's retaining of this particular deterrent, I think is important here. I think that in this world that we're in, I think deterrence is a reality, it's a dangerous reality. You read it how you may, but I don't think every country needs the deterrent itself, and I don't think we do. And I think that I'm not as far away from you as you may think, but I do think that there is something immoral about monstrous intentions, even if you have an intention behind the intention that you would never do it. And I think that it's not of the same grave level as actually doing the bomb, but I think it's pretty damn close to being pretty monstrous.
Can I ask Mr. Ritchie, did you predict the Arab uprisings this year?
This is where proponents of the UK retaining...
No. I just asked you a simple question. And if you could just give me a simple answer.
I'll give you a long, simple answer. The answer is...
I think Lord Cullen, if he was sitting on the bench, would not accept that.
You know the answer is of course, no. But this is where, when we talk about uncertainty in the context of the arguments for our retaining nuclear weapons, we tend to suggest that our capability to threaten other countries with nuclear retaliation is the solution to all manner of uncertainties that we face in the world.
Yeah.
The argument tends to go quite clearly in policy speeches that the current international security environment we are in is unknowable, insecure, dangerous, hostile, and therefore we must retain nuclear weapons, when in fact our retention of nuclear weapons and the logic of nuclear deterrence that they represent provide no solution to the symptoms of all these uncertainties and instabilities. We know that international security challenges are going to be driven by the effects of climate change, growing socio-economic inequality, the spread of conventional weapons. We know all these things. We can see them. And nuclear weapons don't offer any solution to those. Now, that's not to say that a 1940-style situation will never arise again. As I said, we can't predict that, and that's where it becomes one of political judgment. Do we want to make that decision to retain nuclear weapons, to stay in the nuclear weapons business, when the world has changed so considerably since the Cold War situation in which we made the decision to get into the nuclear business? And my view is that, yeah, we can't rule these things out. Of course we can't. But looking at the security challenges we face now, looking out over this long period, with that in mind, I think that really does fundamentally change the calculus compared to that which we made in the late 70s when we bought Trident, for example.
We were talking before we came down about how politicians manage to evade answering questions very superbly, so it's not restricted to the political classes. So you talked about, £25 billion for a very limited potential threat. So you don't conceive that the leadership of Russia and China, for example, might change and be very, very different to the benign governments that we perhaps have in the world at this moment. Over the next 40 years.
Yeah, of course that would change. Yeah, I mean, you can throw all manner of scenarios out and say, can I rule out categorically that a meteor is not going to destroy Northern Europe?
Come on.
That's an extreme example. You can throw out all manner of potential scenarios, which you cannot, by definition, rule out. Now then, okay, let's put this in context then. Can we rule out the emergence of a very hostile Soviet-like, Stalin-like leadership in Beijing or Moscow? No, of course we can't. But looking at the history of the nuclear age, that Cold War period, particularly that intense period, was about 15, 20 years at the start. Then we went through a relatively stable period. Now we're 20 years of post-Cold War, where relationships with those two countries are fundamentally different since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since Tiananmen Square. Really quite fundamentally different. And could things change again? Well, yes, perhaps, but we've got 60 years really of nuclear experience, and 20 years of those with those two major powers have been vastly improved upon the preceding 40. So looking at in that context, that's what I mean when I'm saying making that sort of political judgment. I mean, you can't rule these things out, but we have to make that judgment.
I'm out of time.
Thank you very much. Now I invite Lord Robertson to make his closing statement.
One is off the table. Yeah.
You want to heckle me, Richard?
George, I would never do that.
Oh, come on. Come on. Even the threat might be...
Cheeky.
Hello? Is it 10 minutes I've got? Well, here's the justification for the debate. I think we've had a really good sort of examination here of what is one of the biggest issues that faces the country in the next few years. I accept some of the elements of the long answer that Nick Ritchie gave there today. Indeed, I chaired with Paddy Ashdown a Commission on National Security for the Institute of Public Policy Research with a number of very, very distinguished people, including Professor Michael Clark. And we identified the range of challenges and threats that faced our country and generally in the world today. And they are many and they are various. But they are as of nothing compared to what previous generations faced, especially in the European continent. You know, we had at least 3 major wars every century. In the 20th century, 160 million people died, perished in conflict alone. But since the end of the Cold War, the number of conflicts in the world has gone down by some 80%. The number of casualties per conflict has gone down by a similar percentage. The end of the Cold War brought about a major change in the configuration. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the ideological challenge between the two superpower blocs had gone, and it also had to do with the fact that a major aggressor, thinking that they would embark upon the resolution of a dispute between countries, could do it militarily without cost. And if you go back through the history books, you see that that is what it has been. Now, we cannot forecast now into the future. As Mr. Ritchie said, he didn't predict the Arab Spring, and neither did I. I watch it carefully. I once made a prophecy when I was asked a question in NATO about where it might be there could be a conflict where the Europeans would be called upon to take some action and where the United States of America would be reluctant to intervene. And I said, well, what about the Maghreb, North Africa? But I thought it would start in Algeria. I never thought it was going to start in Tunisia or in Egypt, that Mubarak and Ben Ali, they seemed to be sort of benign dictators and that they were going to go on for some length of time. We can't predict. So that there are nuclear states there among the major powers who may change. I think it was in the Scotsman today, in an editorial, they used, I don't know whether it was in relation to the tram system, but there's a thing for you.
That's our deterrent.
A deterrent to normal civilized living, yeah. And they said that John Kenneth Galbraith once said about forecasters could be divided into two. Those who know they don't know, and those who don't know that they don't know. And that's very profound and very interesting. And I think we have got to make sure that the serious and major threats that exist to us have got to be controlled in a stable a way that is possible. I don't see Russia giving up its nuclear weapons, as Professor Clark said. It is no intention. I know the Russians. I work in Russia today. I know the senior military people in Russia. There is no way. They believe that that is absolutely fundamental to their security. And over the years, they've seen conventional strength in other countries, whether it be in China or in the United States, and they don't intend to give it up. So a nuclear-free world is not going to happen overnight. It's unlikely to the point of exhaustion that President Obama or any successive American president will do it as well. But we cannot forecast what trials and tribulations will be ahead of us, and we've therefore got to plan in advance as to what we actually do about it. We haven't actually heard much about the alternatives to Trident. We've had an absolutist case here this evening, but there are people who say there's a cheap and cheerful model. But I can assure you, and we presented evidence to show, that you can't really do it. It won't be cheaper, and it would be ineffective, and it might be considerably less stable than what we've got just now. Continuous at-sea deterrence. One submarine at sea all of the time. Invulnerable, invisible, always there, and therefore promising that anybody who thought they could win a conventional war or a conventional attack against us or our allies would know that there would be a penalty to pay. I don't believe it would be mutually assured destruction. That concept has moved away, as Professor Clark said, to flexible response. Things are much narrower now with the number of weapons that exist and the accuracy that you have them. But the enemy or the potential aggressor would know, without any doubt, that huge damage would be inflicted upon their military arsenals in any event. So continuous at-sea deterrence with Trident has been tried, it's been tested, it's reliable, the people are trained. I've been on the submarines, I've gone through the firing drill, both from the end of the political end right down to the guys who hold this Colt 45 pistol in their hand and would be the individuals to fire the actual missiles. They take it with enormous and sober seriousness, I can assure you. They are trained to do it. Any suboptimal system would not have that degree of reliability. And I come back to the point that I made before. I am not sure that in a deeply suspicious world, even with the internet and Twitter and all the means of communication, whether anybody would believe that we had done it. The Russians almost certainly would not. They cannot conceive that a country that is a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations and a nuclear weapons power from the beginning would unilaterally give it up. And they would suspect and would continue to suspect much more. I once, when I was in NATO, I used to have visitors coming from China. They came from Russia, former members of the Strategic Rocket Forces, and they came to NATO headquarters, and they looked around in puzzlement. It's a breeze block building based on a hospital design that was temporarily put up when the French threw NATO out under de Gaulle. And they seriously always believed that underneath this breeze block building that would have been condemned for health and safety reasons had it not been for the fact that we were diplomatically protected, that underneath there must be at least 5 or 6 stories of James Bond type control headquarters. But it wasn't. But you couldn't really persuade people that that was the case, and I don't think actually that that would be the case. So you might upset that delicate relationship that exists as well. War between the great powers was the norm in the 20th century and the 19th century and in the 18th century, but not now. And I believe that it is because we have a nuclear deterrent, and Britain's is a key component of that general theory of deterrence. You can decry it, you can diminish it, you can say that it's a chimera, it's psychological, but it exists in the world today. And I don't think that us frivolously giving up, especially at a time when things are changing so fast and so deeply and so profoundly in the world today, that it would make any sense for us to do it. Future generations would not thank us for taking the decision now that might imperil them later on, with no chance of them putting back in place that insurance policy that has actually given us 65 years without any great power conflict in the world today. So I rest my case there and ask you to vote to keep the Trident system. Thank you very much.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, let me just echo what Lord Robertson said. It's a great pleasure, actually, to have a chance to talk about some of the fundamentals and the basics. We all exist in the village, the policy analysis village in London and Edinburgh and other places, where we talk about these things all the time, but we always talk about the details and the policy options and what's going to happen next year and in the next few months and who's feeling about this and who's feeling about that. And so it is a great pleasure and full credit to the institution for encouraging us to talk straightforwardly about some of the fundamentals and to identify, I think, our different sets of beliefs on this. And let me start by saying I personally have no problem with the Trident system as a technological system. If you want to remain a strategic nuclear power, it's an efficient enough system. I'm not arguing that somehow it's mal-designed or maladroit or it's even unaffordable in the long term, although it certainly is pretty unaffordable for the next 10 years. Our argument is a much deeper argument that we think that thinking about the British nuclear deterrent is based on a misplaced faith in the concept of deterrence, which is historically specific to Cold War circumstances. We think it is a metaphysical theory which never actually guided policy to a significant degree. And we were lucky to come through the years that we did, and we cannot expect that condition will exist globally as we go forward to a much more nuclear world, which is the trajectory we're on. And the proposition make a great play of the issue of risk and uncertainty. They say, are we prepared to take the risk of denuclearizing because we don't know what will happen in the next 20 or 30 years' time? Well, that's a risk that Germany takes, and Italy takes, and Sweden takes, and Norway takes, and Brazil, and Argentina, and Chile, and New Zealand, and Australia, etc., and about 190 other countries. take that risk. Now, so my question to them would be, what is so special about the United Kingdom? Why is it that we cannot take those risks, but other nations who are not nuclear don't want to go nuclear? The group of nuclear powers in the world is still relatively small. It is still not too late to conceive of a plausible, less nuclear, or even in the longer term, non-nuclear world. Which brings me to the second major point that we're trying to make, that continuation of the present is not risk-free. The proposition always makes the argument that we're the ones who are risky, we're the ones who are going to change things and take risks for some belief that we can't justify. Well, we say they can't justify the efficacy of deterrence either. But the present is not risk-free, and if we think about other examples of policy, environmental policy, if we carry on as we are, there is a catastrophe waiting out there for us in environmental policy. Most people in the world now accept that. Unless we fundamentally change, we will run into environmental catastrophes in 20, 30, 40 years' time. So in that policy area, we sort of accept that continuation of the present is not risk-free. In fact, it's very risky. The same is true of global demography. If we don't do something about world population and the distribution of that population and the age structure of that population, then the future will be catastrophic. Continuation is a very risky thing to do. The same is true in cyber. If we can carry on relying on cyber systems as much as we do, we're heading for catastrophe. We all accept that. We understand that we have to make changes. So why this area of policy should seem uniquely risky seems to me very odd. Most other countries don't feel that way. And even Michael Quinlan, who's been quoted many times here, he said many times after he retired from the MOD, he said, if we were not already a nuclear power, we probably wouldn't now become one. He was quite happy to say that, and that seems to me to be the truth. And the final point I would make is on timing. Lord Robertson said, this is not the time to give up nuclear weapons. This is not the time to make these decisions. We submit exactly the opposite. Britain has never been as safe as it is now in its history before. The future is uncertain, but continuation is not risk-free. When is a better time? If we say that this is not the right time, in 10 years' time, it's not likely to be a better time. If we say this is not the right time, when we have, I would argue, this window of opportunity, only 9/10 nuclear powers in the world so far, this is actually a rather good time to make an imaginative step. And if we don't take an opportunity that is presenting itself to us now by history in the next 5 to 10 years, then we will condemn ourselves to a nuclear future. And it seems to me then, when the genie is out of the bottle, we will have condemned ourselves globally to a nuclear future, but we still don't have to take part in that. Our argument is that the United Kingdom, without a nuclear weapon, even in a nuclear world, would still be no more unsafe than Germany or Italy or Brazil or Argentina or Ukraine or Australia or New Zealand, blah, blah, blah. Tell us what is special about Britain that would make us more unsafe than those other countries in a highly nuclear world. Ultimately, we are asking you to break the alchemy of thinking about deterrence. Break through this metaphysical chimera and think about the plausibility of a highly restricted or even non-nuclear world. Once we think about it as plausible, it becomes entirely possible. Having said which, I don't expect it to happen. I actually expect that we're on the road to relative disaster. Probably not in my lifetime, but certainly in the lifetime of some of the people in this room. That's what I believe will happen, but it doesn't have to be that way. I think we do have an alternative. We have an alternative now for Britain in the next 5 years, and I ask you to vote against this motion and put us a little bit closer to taking it. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've had some extremely eloquent speeches and evidence this afternoon or this evening, so I won't attempt to try to recapture the eloquence of what has been said, but merely perhaps to remind you of a number of points which have been made as you're thinking about the effect, if any, of what you've heard today. If I begin with Team A, led by Lord Robertson, that team was effectively saying there was a very high onus on anyone who said that at this stage Britain should depart from having Trident. It was referred to as a political statement, namely a threat to use unacceptable damage, and that is the position which they seek to justify. They point to the fact that nuclear stocks exist despite the fact there are some reductions. Many other nations have got nuclear weapons. And they say you never know what is around the next corner, whatever it may be, and therefore it is wrong for this country to give up this important element in its defence. I think it was said by Professor Cornish that reduction in weapons had not discouraged proliferation, and that retention of nuclear weapons had not increased proliferation. In fact, the reverse, it was asserted. Global zero, it was said, was an ideal, but it was a dangerous ideal. And that, broadly speaking, was the main approach taken by Team A. If we turn to Team B, they were emphasising to begin with the fact that, according to them, history has moved on from the Cold War past to a different situation. And nowadays, those nations that do have nuclear weapons can't be assumed to have the same cultural approach to what they think of the weapons and the function of having these weapons means. They also say that the way in which deterrence and minimum stocks have been talked about, these are slippery terms that mean whatever you want them to mean. And there's an opportunity in this country to make a break in order to demonstrate a moral lead which other countries might be encouraged to follow. They also rejected the attempt to distinguish between the threat of force and the actual use of it, standing the treaties that Britain is involved in, standing humanitarian law. There was a very narrow frame of reference, in fact, within which nuclear weapons could conceivably be justified. There was no guarantee against a major attack that those weapons would prevent. There was no absolute necessity for such weapons to exist. Now, in addition to these arguments about practicality and so on, we had, of course, a moral line. And Richard Holloway delivered his Exocet missile into the argument. What he said was that the use of such weapons was not justified by any theory of the just war, and that the mere threat of using such weapons was monstrous, as he put it, inherently immoral, and there was no possible proportion between that sort of threat and any threat that Britain itself might be faced with. He brought it back to Britain itself and said that this country should give a moral lead. And the fact that something might happen did not justify what was proposed to be retained. What was special, he said, and other members of Team B said, what was special about the United Kingdom that it should retain its weapons of this sort? So, on the one hand, you have the argument that the existence of the threat is important itself to prevent the use being done, and on the other hand, you have the argument that the threat itself is immoral. There was some discussion about cost. You heard it said that the retention of Trident would compromise the capability of Great Britain in conventional terms, and such pressures were even greater in today's world. Little's been said, I think, about alternatives. There was an argument, of course, for once Team A rejecting the alternatives to Trident. It seemed to me that the argument came down to all or nothing. In other words, yes or no. You may, of course, find yourself in the middle of the position. You may not be able to make up your mind, or you may want to abstain. That, of course, is entirely for you. So I think with those few remarks, could I invite you to turn to the matter of the second vote. Now, you have the voting pads. I understand that these run out after an hour. So I think you need to rejoin the class, as it were. So would you put in, please, the number which you were given before, 31. 31. And I hope that will show you that you are now re-registered. 31. Remember what you have to do in order to reach that point.
You need to turn it on again.
Yes, turn it on again, of course. It should presumably be on, but if it's on, you still need to join the class, putting in the 31 number. So if you're logged on, are we ready? No. Take a few minutes. If you go to red, remember to try again. Now, can we go? Right. Well, we can start the clock now. This shows me how many people are voting. 57 out of 67, so the number is going up. So it ought to be 67, yes, unless somebody's gone away. Now, perhaps we can see both together now. Now, the first vote is on the right-hand side, yes, and the second vote is on the left-hand side. So you see a slight increase in the no and quite a drop in the middle ground, an increase in yes from 14 to 23.
I think we win proportionately.
Oh, there you are. I trust you enjoyed that.
Well, thank you all. That has been a very, very interesting evening. I think it worked extraordinarily well. The arguments were well put with a mixture of logic and passion. The judge summed up, I must say, remarkably. I don't know how you managed to keep pace with all the different bits of the argument. And one of the terribly important things, those who had no opinion changed from no opinion either one way or the other, and of course we don't know which way they were changing, but the figures changed at the end of the discussion. I think that's an example of the fact that people were listening and they were taking account of what was said. Now, in putting on this, I would like to thank two organisations. One is British Pugwash and the other is the WMD Awareness Programme, both of whom supported this. But above all, to thank those who took part, those who were advocates on either side and those who were evidence on either side, and the gentleman who sat rather than stood in the middle and adjudicated and gave a summing up. And above all, maybe thank all of you for coming here and taking part. I hope you too felt it was a worthwhile evening. It certainly was. Could we thank all those who are sitting on there?